Faith. Can it survive when the world turns its back on you? Caleb was just a boy when fate tested him in the cruelest way. He lost his parents, endured nights of unbearable hunger, and felt the sting of indifference from those who had everything but gave nothing. With bare feet on the cracked desert ground, he walked alone, each step heavier than the last, wondering if God still heard his prayers, or if he had abandoned him too. But in his darkest moment, when his body could take no more, a sign appeared. And what happened next left everyone speechless. Dear family, which country are you watching from? Leave a comment below and don't forget to subscribe to support us. Now let's get started. The Arizona sun was merciless, an unforgiving fire in the sky, beating down on the desert with no shade, no relief. The land stretched endlessly, cracked and broken, scorched by years of heat that had sucked the life from the soil. Caleb walked alone, his bare feet kicking up dust as he moved forward, slow but steady. The road ahead shimmered under the heat, an illusion of water where none existed. His body ached, his breath was shallow, and his legs trembled with every step. Hunger gnawed at him, but thirst was the real enemy now. His lips were cracked, his throat a desert of its own, raw and burning. But he had to keep going. Home was waiting. He could almost hear his grandmother Margaret's voice in the back of his mind, soft but steady. You're stronger than you think, son. Just keep moving. She had raised him with stories of resilience, of faith, of men who fought against impossible odds and survived. But what if he didn't survive this? What if he never made it back? His little sister Lily would be sitting by the window, waiting, watching. She always did that, staring at the road until he returned. And Ben, just 6 years old, would be asking questions, his stomach rumbling, his little hands gripping Margaret's worn dress. Is Caleb bringing food tonight, Grandma? Caleb swallowed hard, his dry throat protesting. He couldn't fail them. Not today, not ever. His vision blurred, his head pounded. The air around him wavered like a living thing, shifting, distorting. The desert had a way of making a man feel small, insignificant, like a grain of sand lost in an endless sea of dust and heat. He tried to focus on the horizon, but the ground beneath him suddenly felt unsteady, as if the earth itself had moved. His knees buckled. The next thing he knew, he was on his hands, fingers digging into the hot dirt, his breath coming in ragged gasps. No, not now. Keep going. He willed his body to move, to rise, to fight. But there was nothing left. His strength was gone, drained from him like water through cracked hands. He thought of home. He thought of Lily, of Ben, of Margaret. And then the world tilted. Darkness wrapped around Caleb like a heavy blanket, pressing down on him, pulling him deeper into unconsciousness. But somewhere in the distance, beyond the silence of the desert, a voice called to him, not loud, not urgent, but steady, familiar. It drifted toward him like a soft breeze cutting through the stillness. Caleb, my love, it's time to wake up. He knew that voice. It was warm, gentle, full of quiet strength. It was the voice of his mother. The darkness cracked, and for a moment, he wasn't lying in the middle of the desert, weak and broken. He was a child again, no more than 6, sitting cross-legged on the wooden floor of their tiny home in Sage Hollow. The scent of warm bread filled the air, and the dim glow of an oil lamp flickered against the walls of the one-room house. His mother, Emily, sat on the edge of the old rocking chair, her Bible resting on her lap, her soft brown hair tucked behind her ears. She was thin, always had been, but there was a light in her eyes that no hardship could ever dim. His father, James, sat nearby, his strong, calloused hands working a dull knife over a block of wood, carving something Caleb couldn't quite see. The rhythmic scrape of the blade was comforting, a familiar sound in their simple home. Come closer, sweetheart, Emily beckoned, and Caleb crawled toward her, resting his head against her knee. She ran her fingers through his messy hair, her touch light as a feather. Tonight, she said, her voice soft but steady, I want to tell you a story about faith. Caleb blinked up at her, waiting. Emily smiled, turning the worn pages of her Bible. There was once a man named Job. He was a good man, honest and kind. He loved God with all his heart. But one day everything was taken from him. His home, his wealth, even his children. He lost everything, Caleb. His little brow furrowed. "That's awful," he whispered. "It was," Emily nodded. "But do you know what Job did?" Caleb shook his head. He never lost his faith. Even when he had nothing left, he still trusted God. And in the end, because of his faith, God restored everything he had lost, twice as much. Caleb thought about that for a moment, looking down at his tiny hands. "So, no matter what happens, we have to trust God?" Emily leaned down, cupping his face in her hands. "That's right, my love. Because even when we don't understand, even when things seem impossible, he has a plan for us." James, who had been listening quietly, set down his carving and reached over to ruffle Caleb's hair. "Your mama's right. Life is hard, son, but you've got a strong heart. Just like Job, you're going to face trials, but as long as you hold on to your faith, you'll never be alone." Caleb didn't fully understand then. He was too young to grasp the weight of their words. But now, lying in the scorching desert, his body barely able to move, he wished more than anything that he could hear his mother's voice again, feel his father's strong hand on his shoulder. A gust of wind stirred the dust around him, whispering through the emptiness. Had God abandoned him? No, he wouldn't believe that. Not now, not ever. With every ounce of strength left in him, Caleb forced his fingers to move, digging into the dirt beneath him. His muscles screamed, his breath came in ragged gasps, but he pushed, just enough to lift his head off the ground. He had to get up. He had to go home. For Margaret, for Lily and Ben, for the family who had once taught him that faith could carry him through anything. The morning light spilled through the cracks in the wooden walls, casting long, golden streaks across the dirt floor of their small home. The air was crisp, carrying the scent of sagebrush and the distant sound of cattle lowing somewhere beyond the horizon. Caleb stirred beneath the thin blanket he shared with his younger siblings, his body still heavy with sleep. But the muffled sound of boots scraping against the floor pulled him from the last wisps of his dreams. His father, James, stood by the door, adjusting the worn leather strap of his satchel. He was already dressed for the long day ahead, his sleeves rolled up to his elbows, revealing forearms tanned and toughened by years of labor under the Arizona sun. His hat, battered but sturdy, sat low over his brow, casting a shadow over his eyes. He looked at his family with the quiet gaze of a man who carried the weight of the world on his shoulders, but bore it without complaint. Caleb sat up, rubbing the sleep from his eyes. "You're leaving early today," he murmured, his voice rough with sleep. James nodded, kneeling beside the bed where Caleb and his siblings lay. "Yeah, son. The rancher needs extra hands this morning. Big job, good pay. Should be home before sundown." His voice was steady, reassuring, like it always was. Caleb wanted to believe that. James reached out, ruffling Caleb's hair, then leaned down to kiss Lily's forehead. The little girl barely stirred, just letting out a soft sigh as she nuzzled deeper into the blankets. Ben, still too young to fully understand anything beyond the warmth of their home, stretched out his small arms, and James scooped him up effortlessly, holding him close for a moment before setting him back down. Emily stood in the doorway of their small kitchen space, her hands absently twisting the frayed edge of her apron. There was always something unspoken in the way she watched James leave in the mornings, an invisible thread of worry stretching between them. She knew the risks of his work, the long hours, the exhaustion, the dangers that lurked in every task, whether it was breaking a wild horse or hauling heavy equipment. But they had no other choice. As James stood, he placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder, his grip warm, strong. "Take care of things while I'm gone, all right?" Caleb nodded, the words an unspoken promise between them. James lingered for just a moment longer, his gaze sweeping over his family as if trying to memorize every detail, every breath, every flicker of movement. Then he exhaled, tipped his hat, and stepped outside. The door swung shut behind him, and just like that, he was gone. The day passed in a haze of routine, chores, cooking, tending to Lily and Ben, while their mother busied herself mending clothes for a neighbor. Caleb tried not to think too much about his father, about how far away he was, about the dangers of working with unpredictable livestock and heavy machinery. James had done this work for years. He always came home. But as the afternoon stretched into evening, an unsettling stillness settled over the house. The sun dipped lower, painting the sky in shades of amber and deep violet, and Caleb found himself glancing toward the door, waiting for the familiar sound of boots on the porch, the low whistle his father always gave before stepping inside. It never came. Instead, as the last light of the day faded into darkness, there was a different sound, the hurried, uneven footsteps of someone approaching. Then a sharp knock at the door. Emily wiped her hands on her apron, her movements slow, almost hesitant, as if some part of her already knew that whatever was on the other side of that door would change everything. She pulled it open, and standing there was Mr. Dalton, their neighbor. His face was pale beneath the dust and sweat that clung to his skin, his hat clutched tightly in his hands. He looked as if he had been carrying something too heavy for too long, and now he had no choice but to lay it down. Emily's fingers tightened around the doorframe. "James?" she asked, though she didn't really need an answer. Mr. Dalton swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing. "Emily? I'm so sorry." Caleb barely registered the words. The world around him seemed to shrink, everything slowing as though time itself had been yanked from beneath his feet. He saw his mother stagger, heard her sharp intake of breath as she pressed a trembling hand to her lips. "No," she whispered. "No, no, no." Then her legs gave out. Caleb moved before he could think, reaching for her just as she crumpled, her body folding in on itself like something fragile breaking under too much weight. He held on to her, gripping her arms, but she barely seemed to notice he was there. Her breath came in short, ragged gasps, her chest rising and falling too fast, her fingers clutching desperately at the fabric of her dress as though trying to hold herself together. Mr. Dalton stepped forward, but he looked just as lost, as helpless, as if he too couldn't believe the words he had just spoken. James was gone. An accident, he explained. A horse, spooked by a rattlesnake, had reared up, knocking James backward. He had fallen hard, hitting his head on a rock. The ranch hands had tried, oh, how they had tried to wake him, to help him. But by the time anyone reached him, it was too late. Caleb felt something inside him crack. His father, his strong, steady father, the man who had always been there, always known what to do, was gone. The words didn't seem real. They didn't belong in this house, in this life. And yet here they were, sitting heavy in the air like a weight pressing down on all of them. Lily and Ben, still too young to understand, sat huddled together in the corner, their eyes wide, their hands gripping each other. Margaret, who had been quietly listening from her chair, closed her eyes and whispered something under her breath. A prayer, maybe, or just a plea for strength. Caleb wanted to say something, to ask how this could have happened, to demand why life kept taking from them when they had so little left to give. But the words caught in his throat, stuck behind the rising lump of grief and shock. James had promised he would be home by sundown. Now he never would be. Outside, the night pressed in, the stars blinking silently overhead, unaware that inside this small, broken house, an entire world had just collapsed. The days after James's death blurred into one long, unforgiving stretch of hardship. There was no time to grieve properly, no moment to sit with the weight of their loss. Life did not stop. The sun still rose each morning, the wind still carried dust through the cracks in their walls, and the hunger in their stomachs did not wait for sorrow to pass. Emily did what she had always done. She fought. She mended clothes by candlelight, her needle moving through fabric as though each stitch could somehow hold their family together. She scrubbed floors in the wealthier homes of Sage Hollow, her hands raw and red from the lye and the soap. She baked bread, sold what little she could at the market, and took in laundry, wringing out sheets until her fingers ached. Whatever work there was, she did it. Caleb saw the exhaustion in her eyes, the way her shoulders slumped when she thought no one was looking. He saw the quiet sacrifices, the way she always gave the biggest portion of food to Lily and Ben, the way she lied so easily when they asked if she'd eaten. "I already had mine," she would say with a smile, but Caleb knew better. At night, after the chores were done and the house was silent except for the steady breathing of his younger siblings, Caleb would find her sitting by the small oil lamp, her Bible open on her lap, the same verse always on her lips. "God will provide," she whispered like a prayer, her fingers tracing the worn edges of the pages. But Caleb wasn't sure he believed that anymore. It wasn't that he wanted to doubt. He had tried to hold on, to trust, to have faith like his mother did. But James had worked himself to the bone, and where had that gotten him? They had lost so much already, and still, it seemed as though life was not done taking from them. And then one morning, he noticed the cough. At first it was small, barely noticeable, just a scratch in her throat that she brushed off with a wave of her hand. "It's nothing," she told him. But then it lingered, grew deeper, harsher. The winter that year was unforgiving, the cold slipping through the walls of their home like an unwelcome guest. They had blankets, but not enough. Food, but never plenty. Emily's cough worsened, and though she tried to hide it, Caleb saw the way it stole the breath from her chest, how it left her weaker each day. She worked anyway. She had no choice. Until one evening, she couldn't. Caleb found her sitting by the fire, her hands shaking as she reached for her cup of tea. She had tried to stand but had barely made it 2 steps before her legs gave out beneath her. Caleb caught her before she hit the ground, his arms wrapping around her frail frame. "Ma, you need to rest," he said, his voice edged with fear. Emily let out a weak chuckle, resting her head against his shoulder. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, "I don't think rest is what I need." Something in the way she said it made his chest tighten. That night, she didn't get up from bed. Margaret sat by her side, holding her hand, whispering prayers that sounded more like pleas. Lily and Ben curled up together in the corner of the room, too young to fully understand what was happening, but old enough to sense that something was wrong. Caleb sat on the edge of the bed, his hands clenched into fists, his heart pounding so loudly he could barely hear the crackling of the fire. Emily's eyes fluttered open, her gaze finding his. "Come here, my love." He moved closer, his breath unsteady. She lifted a trembling hand, brushing his cheek the way she used to when he was small. "You've always been strong," she murmured. "Even when you were little, I knew. You were meant for something greater than this." "Ma, don't..." She hushed him gently. "Listen to me, Caleb." He swallowed hard. "Never stop believing," she said, her voice soft but firm. "Even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible, hold on to your faith, because it will carry you further than your legs ever could." Caleb bit the inside of his cheek, willing himself not to cry. She gave his hand a final squeeze, then let out a slow, steady breath. And then, nothing. A silence so deep it felt like the world itself had stopped. Caleb stared, willing her chest to rise again, willing her fingers to twitch, wishing, praying, please just one more breath. But she was gone. Margaret let out a quiet sob, clutching Emily's hand against her chest. Lily and Ben, still too young to truly grasp the finality of death, clung to each other, their small faces buried in each other's shoulders. Caleb sat frozen, his mother's last words echoing in his head. Never stop believing. But how could he? How could he believe in anything when the only thing he had ever been certain of had just slipped away? The night after Emily's passing stretched endlessly, heavy and suffocating. The small house felt emptier than ever, though every inch of it was still filled with her presence. The faint scent of lavender from the blanket she used to wrap around her shoulders, the unfinished basket of mending near the fireplace, the Bible resting on the nightstand beside her bed. Caleb sat on the wooden floor beside his siblings, staring into the dying embers of the fire. Lily had finally cried herself to sleep, curled up against their grandmother, Margaret, whose thin fingers traced soothing circles on the little girl's back. Ben clung to Caleb's arm, his tiny hands gripping the fabric of his brother's shirt, as if afraid that letting go would mean losing someone else. Caleb hadn't cried, not yet. There was no time for grief, no space to break down. The weight of everything, the hunger, the emptiness, the crushing uncertainty, pressed down on him, but he refused to crumble beneath it. Tomorrow the sun would rise, and no matter how much he wanted the world to stop, it wouldn't. So he would have to keep moving. Before the first light of dawn broke over the horizon, Caleb was already up. The air outside was cold, sharp against his skin, but it helped clear his mind. He had one goal: find work, find something, anything that could put food on the table. He made his way down the dirt road toward town, his boots kicking up small clouds of dust as he walked. The early morning silence was heavy, interrupted only by the distant howl of a coyote and the occasional rustling of dry branches in the wind. Sage Hollow was waking up slowly, the town still wrapped in the pale hues of morning, but Caleb couldn't afford to wait. By the time he reached the heart of town, the first vendors were setting up in the market square. The scent of fresh bread drifted from the baker's shop, and for a brief moment, his stomach twisted painfully, but he forced himself to ignore it. He approached the general store first, stepping inside as the owner, Mr. Tate, arranged goods on the shelves. "Morning, sir," Caleb said, keeping his voice steady. Mr. Tate barely looked up. "What do you need, boy?" Caleb clenched his fists, forcing himself to remain polite. "I was wondering if you needed help. Stocking shelves, sweeping, whatever you need done, I'll do it." The older man finally glanced up, eyeing him for a moment before shaking his head. "I don't have the money to be handing out jobs, son. Try somewhere else." Caleb nodded, swallowing down his disappointment. "Thank you anyway." He left without another word. The next stop was the blacksmith's shop. Mr. Reed, the town blacksmith, was a thick-shouldered man with hands like iron, his face perpetually coated in soot. "You ever worked a forge before?" he asked, raising an eyebrow at Caleb. "No, sir," Caleb admitted, "but I can learn." The blacksmith let out a grunt, shaking his head. "Takes more than willingness, kid. Takes strength, skill. Can't have you slowing me down." Another rejection. Caleb kept moving. He tried the stables, the butcher, even the saloon, but no one wanted to hire a boy with no experience. Some simply turned him away with a dismissive shake of the head. Others looked at him with a kind of pity that made his stomach turn. By midday, his feet ached, his throat was dry, and the weight of failure settled heavily on his shoulders. But he refused to go home empty-handed. So he kept asking, kept pushing forward, even as door after door closed in his face. Eventually, as the afternoon sun hung high in the sky, he found himself outside a warehouse near the edge of town. Men were loading sacks of grain onto a cart, their faces slick with sweat, their arms straining under the weight. Caleb hesitated for only a moment before stepping forward. "Do you need help?" he asked the foreman, a grizzled man with deep lines etched into his face. The man wiped his brow, looking Caleb up and down. "You ever done this kind of work before?" "No," Caleb admitted, "but I'm strong, and I won't complain." The foreman studied him for a moment longer, then shrugged. "Fine, but don't slow us down." Caleb nodded, stepping into line with the others. The first sack of grain nearly knocked him off balance. It was heavier than he had expected, his arms straining as he hoisted it onto his shoulder. The men around him worked quickly, moving with practiced ease, and Caleb struggled to keep up. Sweat dripped down his face, his back aching with the effort. But he didn't stop, didn't slow down. Every time his muscles screamed at him to rest, he thought of Lily and Ben waiting at home, their bellies empty, their eyes full of quiet hope. He worked until the last cart was loaded, until the last sack was stacked, and when the foreman finally handed him a few crumpled bills, Caleb didn't even look at them before stuffing them into his pocket. It wasn't much, but it was something, and that was enough to keep him going. The sun had long since dipped below the horizon, leaving behind streaks of deep orange and fading purple in the Arizona sky. The air, once thick with heat, had cooled into something more bearable, but the exhaustion in Caleb's bones remained. He could still feel the weight of the grain sacks pressing into his shoulders, the dull ache in his muscles refusing to fade. His shirt clung to his back, damp with sweat and dust, but none of it mattered now, because in his hand, wrapped tightly in a scrap of cloth, was a loaf of bread. It wasn't much, certainly not enough to fill their stomachs for long, but it was food, real food, the kind of food Lily and Ben had gone too many nights without. He imagined their faces when he walked through the door, the way Lily's eyes would widen with relief, the way Ben would grab at the bread with his small, eager hands. He imagined Margaret's tired smile, her quiet prayer of gratitude whispered under her breath. He picked up his pace, his boots scuffing against the dirt road that led home. Then, just as he rounded a bend, he heard something, a sound so faint he almost missed it. A soft, broken whimper carried on the wind. Caleb slowed, his pulse quickening. His eyes darted toward the side of the road, where the shadows stretched long and deep. And then he saw her. A woman sat hunched against the base of a twisted mesquite tree, her back pressed into the rough bark as though she no longer had the strength to hold herself upright. Her dress was torn and filthy, hanging off her thin frame in tattered folds. Strands of dark, unkempt hair clung to her damp forehead, and her face, God, her face was hollowed by hunger, her cheekbones sharp, her lips cracked and dry. But it wasn't her Caleb noticed first. It was the baby in her arms, a tiny thing, wrapped in nothing more than a frayed scrap of cloth, its face barely visible in the dim light. The baby let out another weak cry, its little mouth opening, searching for something. Food, comfort, anything. Caleb stopped in his tracks, gripping the loaf of bread tighter. The woman stirred, lifting her head with effort. Her eyes, sunken and rimmed with exhaustion, locked onto his. "Please," she rasped, her voice so hoarse it was almost unrecognizable as human. "My son. He hasn't eaten in days." A chill that had nothing to do with the cool night air settled over Caleb. He swallowed hard, his fingers tightening around the bread. He thought of home, of Lily, of Benjamin, of the way their stomachs ached with hunger at night, the way their small voices sometimes trembled when they asked if there would be food tomorrow. This bread, it was for them. He had worked for this, bled for this. And yet, standing there, staring at the desperate woman before him, he heard another voice, his mother's. "Never stop believing, my son, even when it's hard, even when it feels impossible." He closed his eyes for the briefest of moments, willing the war inside him to stop. Then, before he could change his mind, he stepped forward and knelt beside the woman. "Here," he said, voice thick. Her eyes flickered to the bread, disbelief flashing across her face. "But your family, take it," he insisted, pressing the loaf into her trembling hands. She didn't move at first, just stared at him, as if she couldn't quite believe what was happening. Then, with shaking fingers, she tore off a piece and placed it gently against the baby's lips. The child latched on instinctively, sucking hungrily at the soft bread. A sob broke from the woman's throat. "God bless you," she whispered, fresh tears spilling down her cheeks. Caleb forced himself to nod, ignoring the gnawing emptiness in his stomach, the sharp ache of regret already creeping in. He turned away before he could second-guess himself, before he could snatch the bread back and run all the way home. By the time he reached the small, weathered house, the night had deepened. He stepped inside quietly, careful not to wake Margaret, who lay resting in her chair, a knitted blanket draped over her fragile frame. Across the room, Lily and Ben stirred in their sleep, curled up beneath a thin quilt, their breathing slow and even. For a moment, Caleb just stood there, staring at them. They would wake up hungry, and there would be nothing for them. His chest tightened, guilt pressing down like a weight too heavy to bear. Had he done the right thing? He thought of the baby, the way its tiny mouth had latched onto the bread, the way its cries had softened into something almost peaceful. He thought of the woman's tears, and he didn't know. The morning came with a quiet heaviness, the kind that settled deep into Caleb's bones before he even opened his eyes. The hunger from the night before was still there, gnawing at his stomach, but something else clawed at his chest, a sense of unease he couldn't shake. The house was unusually still, the only sound the faint rustling of the wind slipping through the cracks in the walls. Then a cough, sharp and hoarse, broke the silence. Caleb bolted upright. Lily. She was curled beneath the thin quilt, her small body trembling despite the warmth of the morning sun creeping in through the window. Her skin was pale except for the bright flush high on her cheeks, and when she opened her eyes, they were glassy, unfocused. Margaret sat beside her, pressing a damp cloth to the girl's forehead. She looked up as Caleb moved closer, her face lined with quiet worry. "She's burning up," she murmured. Caleb's stomach clenched. Lily let out a weak whimper, her little fingers clutching the edge of the blanket. Caleb, she rasped. I'm here, Lil, he said quickly, brushing the damp strands of hair from her forehead. Her skin was scorching. Margaret exhaled, deep and slow. She needs medicine, Caleb. The words landed like a blow. Medicine. That meant money. Money they didn't have. Caleb clenched his jaw. I'll get it. Before Margaret could protest, he was already out the door. The town was awake by the time he arrived, the streets filled with early morning activity, vendors setting up their stalls, shopkeepers sweeping dust from their doorways, travelers passing through with heavy bags and tired eyes. Caleb didn't stop for any of it. He made straight for the general store, pushing open the door with more force than necessary. Mr. Tate looked up from behind the counter, startled. Mr. Tate, please, Caleb started, breathless. My sister, she's real sick. She's burning up. I need medicine. The shopkeeper frowned, his expression immediately guarded. Caleb swallowed hard. I don't have money right now, but I can work. I'll do anything. Just please. Mr. Tate shook his head. I'm sorry, son. That's not how business works. Caleb felt the floor tilt beneath him. Please, he tried again, desperation creeping into his voice. I'll work for free until it's paid off. You know I'm good for it. I can't just be giving away supplies, Mr. Tate interrupted, his tone firm but not unkind. It wouldn't be fair to the others. Caleb opened his mouth, but he already knew it was useless. He turned and ran. The apothecary was next. He stumbled inside, nearly knocking into the counter as he faced the old pharmacist, Mr. Monroe. The man eyed him over his spectacles, his hands carefully measuring herbs into small glass jars. Boy, you're looking rough, he muttered, not glancing up from his work. My sister, Caleb gasped. She's sick. She's real sick. I need something for the fever. That's so, Mr. Monroe said, finally looking up. Caleb nodded furiously. Yes, sir. I don't have money, but I can pay you back. The old man's face hardened. No credit. Caleb's breath hitched. Please, he whispered. Mr. Monroe simply shook his head and went back to his work, as if the conversation had already ended. The rejection hit him like a kick to the stomach. The streets blurred as he stumbled outside, his breath coming fast and ragged. No one would help. No one cared. Lily was back home, burning up, and he had nothing. He dragged himself toward the butcher shop, then the tailor, then the stable master, begging for work, any work. But the answer was always the same. Nothing today. Try again later, maybe next week. It took everything in him not to scream. By the time he reached the outskirts of town, the sun was high overhead, beating down on him like a punishment. His legs felt heavy, his throat dry, but he couldn't go home empty-handed. He walked past the church, hesitating only for a moment before pushing open the doors. The room was cool and quiet, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling the air. Reverend Dawson stood near the altar, arranging hymnals on the pews. Caleb swallowed his pride and stepped forward. Reverend, he said, his voice hoarse. The older man turned, his kind eyes studying Caleb's face. Son, what brings you here? Caleb forced the words out. Lily, she's sick. She's got a fever. I don't have anything to give her. His voice cracked, raw with exhaustion and helplessness. The Reverend exhaled, his expression unreadable. For a moment, Caleb hoped that he might offer something, anything. Then he shook his head. I'm sorry, Caleb, he said gently. I truly am. But the church is struggling too. We've given out what we can. Caleb felt something inside him snap. He nodded stiffly and turned on his heel before the man could see the tears burning in his eyes. By the time he made it home, his body felt like it was moving through water. Margaret was still by Lily's side, the little girl's breathing shallow, her skin slick with sweat. Caleb sank to his knees beside her, defeated. I couldn't get anything, he admitted, the words bitter on his tongue. Margaret didn't scold him. She just reached for his hand, giving it a small squeeze. Then we'll do what we can with what we have, she said softly. She gathered herbs from the small garden outside, brewed a weak tea, and pressed cold rags to Lily's forehead. It wasn't enough. It wouldn't be enough. That night, Caleb sat awake, listening to Lily's uneven breathing, wondering how much more they would have to endure and how much more they could take. The next morning arrived in a haze of exhaustion. The weight of another sleepless night pressed down on Caleb as he sat by Lily's side, watching the slow rise and fall of her chest. The fever hadn't broken. Margaret stirred beside him, her face drawn with worry. She had barely left Lily's side, whispering prayers, pressing damp claws to the girl's burning forehead, doing everything she could with what little they had. But it wasn't enough. Caleb clenched his fists, his jaw tight with frustration. He had failed. Again. But he couldn't afford to dwell on that. He had to try one more time. The sun was already climbing high when he stepped outside, the air thick with heat, the sky an endless stretch of blue. His body ached from the previous day's efforts, every muscle stiff and sore. But none of that mattered. He needed to find work, needed to find something that would bring home even a few coins for medicine or food. So he walked. The journey to town felt longer that morning, the road stretching endlessly ahead of him, each step heavier than the last. He had barely eaten in days, and the heat clung to him like a second skin, pulling the moisture from his body faster than he could replace it. By the time he reached town, his vision swam. The streets were already alive with movement, merchants calling out their wares, wagons creaking under heavy loads, the scent of fresh bread and roasted meat drifting through the air. His stomach twisted painfully at the smell, but he ignored it. He went straight to the warehouse. The same foreman from the day before was there, barking orders at the workers hauling sacks of grain onto waiting carts. Caleb forced himself forward. "Sir," he called, his voice raw. The man barely glanced at him. "Back again?" "I need work," Caleb said, his breath shallow. "I'll take anything." The foreman let out a short laugh. "You barely made it through yesterday. I don't need another weak set of hands slowing my men down." Caleb's stomach dropped, but he didn't move. "I won't slow you down," he insisted. "Please." The man shook his head. "Not today, kid. Try somewhere else." Caleb opened his mouth to argue, but the words caught in his throat. The sun bore down on him, waves of heat rising from the ground, blurring the edges of his vision. He turned, stumbling away from the warehouse, willing himself to keep going. Somewhere, someone had to be willing to give him a chance. But as he walked, each step felt heavier than the last. The heat pressed against him, thick and suffocating. His limbs felt sluggish, his heartbeat slow and unsteady. The world around him wavered, shifting like ripples in a pond. Then his knees buckled. The ground rushed up to meet him, his body hitting the scorching earth with a force that knocked the breath from his lungs. Dust rose around him, filling his mouth, his nose. He tried to move, tried to push himself up, but his arms wouldn't obey. The sky above blurred, the sun a blinding white disk, pulsing, growing larger, consuming everything. Then, darkness, a silence deeper than anything he had ever known. And in that silence, a voice, software, steady. Caleb. He wasn't lying in the dirt anymore. The burning sun, the weight of exhaustion, all of it had vanished. Instead, he stood in a place unlike any he had ever seen. A vast field stretched before him, golden and endless, bathed in a warm, glowing light. A soft breeze brushed against his skin, carrying the scent of something sweet and unfamiliar. Then he saw her, a woman dressed in white, standing in the distance. She was radiant, not in the way the sun was, blinding and harsh, but in a way that felt soothing, like the first touch of dawn after a long, endless night. She stepped forward, her movements graceful, effortless, as though she were untouched by the weight of the world. "You have endured much, my child," she said, her voice like a melody carried on the wind. "But God never abandons those who do good." Caleb's throat tightened. "I tried," he whispered. "I tried so hard." "And you must continue to try," she said gently. She lifted her hand and suddenly the golden field shifted. Caleb saw himself, but not as he was now. He was older, stronger, his face no longer hollowed by hunger, his clothes no longer worn and tattered. He stood tall, speaking to a group of people, men, women, children, offering them food, guidance, hope. He saw himself placing a loaf of bread into the hands of a young boy, the same way he had given his last piece of bread to that mother and her child. He saw a life where he wasn't just surviving, he was helping, he was leading, he was changing things. Tears burned his eyes. "Is this real?" he asked, "or just a dream?" The woman smiled, her gaze filled with a kind of knowing that made his chest ache. "This is the path meant for you," she said, "but only if you choose to walk it." Then the golden light faded, the warmth vanished, and the pain returned. Caleb gasped as consciousness slammed into him, his lungs burning as he sucked in a ragged breath. The sky above him was the same scorching blue. The dust clung to his skin, the weight of his body still pressing into the hot earth. But something inside him had changed. He pushed himself up, his muscles shaking, his head spinning. The pain was still there. The hunger was still there. But so was something else, something stronger, determination. He wiped the sweat from his brow, his fingers trembling, and forced himself to his feet. He didn't know exactly how, or when, or what it would take, but he would find a way. He would keep moving, because the woman had been right. God never abandoned those who did good, and neither would he. The journey home felt longer than ever. Caleb's legs trembled beneath him, his body weak from exhaustion and thirst, but he pressed forward. The sun still burned high in the sky, beating down on his already battered frame, but something deeper within him urged him onward. The vision still clung to him. The woman in white, the golden fields, the future she had shown him. It had felt so real, more real than the heat of the desert or the ache in his limbs. But was it truly a message, or just the fevered imaginings of a starving boy on the edge of collapse? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing. He had to keep moving. Step by step, he forced his body forward, his feet dragging against the dirt road that led back to the only place he had ever known as home. The sun was beginning to set by the time he reached the outskirts of the small house. The sky had softened into shades of deep amber and dusty pink, and the wind had cooled, stirring the dry grass around him. Then through the dim light, he saw her. Margaret. She was on her knees outside the front door, hands clasped together, head bowed. Her lips moved in silent prayer, her frail shoulders trembling with the weight of her words. Caleb stopped, his breath catching in his throat. She was praying for him. A lump formed in his chest, heavy with emotion. He took a shaky step forward. The moment the sound of his boots hit the dry earth, Margaret's head snapped up. Her eyes locked onto his, wide with disbelief. "Caleb!" Her voice broke on his name, as if she couldn't believe what she was seeing. The next moment, she was pushing herself to her feet, moving toward him as fast as her aging body would allow. When she reached him, she lifted a trembling hand and cupped his face, her fingers brushing over the dust and sweat that clung to his skin. "Oh, my boy," she whispered, her voice thick with relief. I feared." Her words faltered, and before Caleb could say anything, she pulled him into a tight embrace. For a moment, he let himself sink into it. The warmth, the familiarity, the safety of her arms around him. It was enough to break something loose inside him. "I saw something," he murmured against her shoulder, his voice raw. Margaret pulled back slightly, studying his face. "What do you mean?" Caleb swallowed, his throat dry. "I collapsed. Out in the desert. I thought I was dying." Her fingers tightened on his arms, but she didn't speak, waiting. "And then," he continued, his voice barely above a whisper, "I saw a woman. She was dressed in white, and she told me that God never abandons those who do good." Margaret inhaled sharply, her grip on him firm. "She showed me something, Grandma," he went on, his words tumbling out faster now. "A future, one where I'm strong, where I'm helping people. It felt real." Silence stretched between them, the only sound the soft rustling of the wind. Then Margaret reached up and gently placed a hand over his heart. "My sweet boy," she whispered, her eyes glistening. "God has a plan for you." Caleb's breath shuddered. "But how do I know if it was real? How do I know if—" Margaret smiled, the kind of smile that carried years of faith and understanding. "Because, Caleb," she said softly, "you're still standing." Her words settled deep into his bones, filling the hollow space inside him. He had made it home. He had survived. And maybe, just maybe, that was proof enough. The next morning, Caleb rose before the sun. The air was cool, carrying the lingering scent of desert sage, and the sky above was still dusted with the last remnants of night. He sat on the edge of the worn wooden bed, running a hand through his unkempt hair, feeling the dull ache in his limbs from the day before. But beneath the exhaustion, something new stirred inside him. Resolve. He wasn't sure what the vision had meant, if it had been real, if it had been a message from God, or simply the desperate imaginings of a starving boy. But it didn't matter. He had been given a glimpse of something greater, and now, for the first time in his life, he felt the weight of purpose pressing against his chest. There was no time to waste. Margaret was already awake when he stepped into the main room, a steaming cup of tea cradled in her weathered hands. She gave him a knowing look, as if she had expected him to wake early, as if she already knew what was on his mind. "Going back to town?" she asked. Caleb nodded. She didn't try to stop him. Instead, she reached out, squeezing his hand briefly before releasing it. "Go on then," she said softly. "And remember, you were made for more than this hardship." With those words warming his heart, he left. By the time he reached the town square, the marketplace was already alive with movement. Vendors arranged their goods, calling out their wares, the air thick with the scent of fresh bread and roasting meat. The sight of food made his stomach clench painfully, but he forced himself to ignore it. He needed work. He scanned the busy streets, looking for any opportunity, any sign that someone might need an extra set of hands. Then out of the corner of his eye, he saw something. An old man, frail and hunched, was making his way slowly across the square, leaning heavily on a cane. His steps were unsteady, his body swaying slightly with each movement. Caleb watched as the man tried to step over a loose stone and stumbled. Before he could hit the ground, Caleb was moving. His feet pounded against the dirt road as he surged forward, his arms catching the man just in time. "Easy there, sir," he said, steadying the old man against him. The man gripped Caleb's arm, his fingers weak but desperate. His breathing was shallow, his face pale. I didn't see the stone," he murmured. "It's all right," Caleb assured him. "You're safe now." He gently guided the man to a nearby bench, lowering him down carefully. The old man let out a heavy sigh, shaking his head. "These bones aren't what they used to be," he muttered. Caleb chuckled softly. "I think you did just fine." As he spoke, a shadow fell over them. Caleb glanced up and immediately straightened. A man stood before him, tall and well-dressed, his dark coat crisp, his boots polished, his entire presence radiating authority. His piercing gaze studied Caleb with quiet interest. "I saw what you did," the man said. His voice was deep, measured, carrying the kind of weight that made people listen. Caleb shifted uncomfortably. It was nothing. He needed help. The man tilted his head slightly, as if assessing him. "What's your name, son?" "Caleb." The man nodded, as if filing the name away in his mind. "I'm Samuel," he said. "I run a business in the city, and I think a boy like you deserves a real opportunity." Caleb blinked, unsure if he had heard correctly. "What?" Samuel gestured toward the town square, toward the vendors, the weary workers, the people barely scraping by. "You're a hard worker, I can see that, and you have something that most men lack these days." Caleb hesitated. "What's that?" "Kindness," Samuel said simply. Something in the way he said it made Caleb's throat tighten. "You don't belong here, son," Samuel continued. "You're meant for more than just struggling to survive. I'm offering you a job, real work, a place in the city where you can earn enough to provide for your family." Caleb's heart pounded. A real job, a real chance. But his family, Lily, Ben, Margaret, they needed him here. Samuel seemed to sense his hesitation. He placed a firm hand on Caleb's shoulder, meeting his gaze. "This isn't just for you," he said. "It's for them too. Take this chance, Caleb. Change your life. Change their lives." Caleb swallowed hard, his mind racing. Was this it? The future the woman in white had shown him? Was this the moment everything changed? He took a deep breath, then nodded. "I'll do it," he said. Samuel smiled, a knowing glint in his eyes. Good choice, son. Let's get started. And just like that, Caleb took his first step into an uncertain but hopeful future. The days that followed Caleb's decision moved faster than he could have imagined. Samuel was a man of his word. By the time the sun had fully risen the next morning, Caleb found himself on the back of a wagon headed for the city. The dry, endless landscape of Sage Hollow stretched behind him, fading into the distance with every mile. The dust, the hunger, the familiar ache of hopelessness, he left it all behind. But not forever, because Caleb wasn't leaving to escape. He was leaving to fight for something better. The city was nothing like the quiet, sun-baked town he had always known. The streets bustled with life, filled with vendors shouting their prices, carriages rattling over cobblestone, and workers rushing to jobs that actually paid enough to feed their families. The buildings were taller, the people moved faster, and the air carried the scent of roasting meat and fresh bread. Food Caleb had only ever dreamed of. Samuel wasted no time. Caleb was put straight to work in the merchant district, loading crates onto carts, stacking sacks of grain in storehouses, and running messages between traders. The labor was exhausting, but it was honest work. And for the first time in his life, Caleb was surrounded by people who expected him to succeed rather than assuming he would fail. Each day, his hands grew rougher, his muscles stronger. And though the city was loud and unfamiliar, he held on to one thought. Lily, Ben, and Margaret were waiting for him. He had no intention of letting them down. At the end of his first week, just as the sun dipped below the rooftops, Samuel called him into his office. The room smelled of ink and parchment, and stacks of carefully balanced ledgers lined the desk where Samuel sat, his sharp eyes scanning numbers that Caleb couldn't yet understand. "You've worked hard," Samuel said without looking up. "That's good. You'll go far if you keep at it." Caleb nodded, unsure of what to say. Then Samuel reached into the desk drawer and pulled out a small leather pouch. "Your wages," he said simply, tossing it to Caleb. Caleb caught it, his fingers tightening around the weight of it. He hesitated for a moment before loosening the drawstring. Inside, nestled against the worn leather, was more money than he had ever held in his life. His breath caught. His hands trembled slightly as he ran his thumb over the coins, feeling their cool weight press into his palm. This wasn't a handout. This wasn't pity. This was his, earned with sweat and aching muscles, earned with early mornings and late nights, earned with the belief that he could be more. "Go home, kid," Samuel said, leaning back in his chair. "I'm sure your family's waiting." Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He left the office at a run, the city blurring past him as he weaved through the crowds, barely aware of the setting sun painting the sky in fiery shades of orange and violet. His feet barely touched the ground as he reached the market. For the first time in his life, he stepped inside the general store not as a beggar, but as a customer. Mr. Tate, the storekeeper who had turned him away so many times before, barely looked up as Caleb approached the counter. "I need flour," Caleb said, voice steady, "and bread, a sack of rice, and medicine, something for fever." Mr. Tate finally glanced up, raising an eyebrow. "You planning to pay for all that?" Caleb didn't answer. He simply reached into his pocket and placed the pouch of coins on the counter. Mr. Tate's expression shifted. Just for a second. Caleb didn't wait for a reaction. He took his goods, packed them carefully into a burlap sack, and left. The moment he stepped outside, he inhaled sharply. He had done it, for the first time since his father's death, since his mother had fallen ill, since the weight of the world had been placed on his shoulders. He had won. The road home had never felt shorter. When he reached the small house, he could already hear Margaret's voice inside, murmuring quiet words of comfort to Lily. He stepped onto the porch, his heartbeat hammering, and pushed open the door. Margaret looked up. For a moment, the only sound was the creak of the wooden boards beneath his feet. Then her eyes fell on the sack in his hands. Lily, still weak, slightly stirred at the noise, her weary eyes glancing towards him. Ben sprang up, his small hands clenched tightly in his lap. "I brought food," Caleb said, his voice rough with emotion, "and medicine." Margaret's lips parted, as if she wanted to say something, but couldn't find the words. Ben was the first to move. He scrambled toward Caleb, his hands reaching for the sack as if afraid it would disappear. Bread, real fresh bread. Lily let out a soft sound, half disbelief, half relief. Margaret pressed a trembling hand to her mouth, tears brimming in her tired eyes. She whispered something, too soft for Caleb to hear. Then with a quiet sob, she lifted her face to the ceiling, her hands still clasped together as she spoke the words again, this time louder. "Thank you, Lord. You have answered our prayers." Caleb swallowed hard, his throat tight. He wasn't sure if God had answered their prayers, or if God had simply given him the strength to make it happen. But as he watched his siblings take their first real bites of food in days, as he saw the weight of fear ease from Margaret's face, he knew one thing for certain. For the first time in a long, long while, hope had returned to their home. The days turned into weeks, and for the first time in Caleb's life, he woke up knowing that he was building towards something greater. Each morning before dawn, he was already at work, hauling sacks of grain, stacking crates, and running errands through the busy streets of the city. The work was hard, the hours long, but he never once complained. Every ache in his muscles, every bead of sweat that rolled down his back, none of it mattered compared to the thought of his family finally having a life beyond hunger and desperation. Samuel had taken him under his wing, showing him not just how to labor, but how to understand the business. "You're not just here to carry loads, Caleb," Samuel had told him one afternoon, watching as he carefully measured out stock in the warehouse. "A man who learns more than what's expected of him will always rise higher." And Caleb took those words to heart. He paid attention to everything, how the shipments were recorded, how deals were struck between merchants, how Samuel handled customers with both kindness and unshakable authority. Caleb didn't just work, he absorbed every lesson, storing them away for the future he was determined to build. At the end of each week, when Samuel placed a pouch of wages in his hand, Caleb resisted the temptation to spend it all. He had more money now than he'd ever known, and for the first time, he had the power to choose how it was used. Some of it he sent home with the supply cars that traveled back to Sage Hollow. The first time Margaret had received his earnings, a letter had come back with the driver, written in her shaky, careful handwriting. "My dear boy, you have lifted a burden I feared would never ease. May God bless you always." Caleb had held that letter for a long time, feeling the weight of it just as deeply as he felt the coins in his pocket. But most of his earnings he saved, because he wasn't just working to survive. He was working to bring his family here, to build something lasting. He didn't know how long it would take, but he was willing to wait. One evening, as he finished counting stock in the back of the shop, Samuel appeared in the doorway, arms crossed, his expression unreadable. "You've been saving," the man remarked. Caleb straightened, unsure of where this conversation was going. "Yes, sir." "For what?" Caleb wiped his hands on his work-worn trousers. "A home," he said simply. "For my grandmother and my siblings. I want to bring them here." Samuel studied him for a long moment, then gave a short nod. "Come with me." Caleb hesitated but quickly followed as Samuel led him out of the warehouse and down the bustling street. The city was beginning to quiet as the day's business wrapped up, but a few vendors still remained, their lanterns casting flickering pools of light onto the cobblestone roads. Samuel stopped in front of a modest brick house near the outskirts of town. It wasn't large, it wasn't grand, but it was solid, and it was more than anything Caleb had ever dreamed of. Samuel turned to him, a knowing gleam in his eye. "It's available," he said. "Not too big, but enough for a family. You've worked hard, and I believe in rewarding men who show they've got a future worth investing in." Caleb's breath caught. Samuel let the words settle before continuing. "I'll help you with the first payment," he said. "You'll pay me back in time, but this will be yours." The words rang in Caleb's ears, his heartbeat roaring like a drum inside his chest. A home, a real home. Not a crumbling shack, barely holding together in the desert winds. Not a place where the walls let in the cold, or where hunger sat at the dinner table like an unwelcome guest. A home where Lily and Ben could grow up safe, where Margaret wouldn't have to work herself to the bone just to survive. His throat tightened, but he forced himself to meet Samuel's gaze. "Why are you doing this for me?" Samuel smiled, but there was something deeper behind it, something Caleb couldn't quite name. "Because someone once did it for me." The weight of those words settled deep into Caleb's soul. He swallowed hard and nodded. "I won't waste this chance," he promised. Samuel clapped a firm hand on his shoulder. "I know you won't, son." As Caleb stared at the house, the last light of day painting its walls in warm hues of gold, he realized something. His prayers were being answered. Not all at once, not in the way he had once imagined, but in steady, quiet ways, through work, through sacrifice, through the kindness of those who believed in him. And for the first time in his life, he didn't just hope for a better future. He could see it. The wagon rattled along the familiar dirt road, kicking up clouds of dust in its wake. The desert stretched endlessly on either side, the same dry, cracked earth Caleb had walked for years. But this time, he wasn't trudging across it in desperation. This time, he was coming home with a promise. As Sage Hollow appeared on the horizon, his chest tightened. He could already picture the little house, the sagging roof, the walls patched together with whatever Margaret had been able to find, the rickety door that barely held against the wind. He had spent his whole life within those four fragile walls, dreaming of something more, and now he had found it. The wagon rolled to a stop in front of the house, and for a long moment, Caleb just sat there, gripping the reins with trembling hands. Then, the door creaked open. Ben was the first to appear, his small frame thin but energetic as he raced onto the porch. The moment his wide eyes landed on Caleb, he let out a shout. "Caleb's home!" The cry echoed through the small house, and suddenly everything was in motion. Lily, still weak but stronger than the last time he had seen her, appeared in the doorway, her face breaking into a radiant smile. And then Margaret stepped forward, her hands pressed together as if in silent prayer. Caleb climbed down, his boots hitting the dusty ground. For a moment, he simply stood there, drinking in the sight of them, their faces, their joy, their relief. Then he spoke the words that would change everything. "We're moving!" The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. Lily blinked. Ben frowned. Margaret's breath hitched. "What did you say?" Caleb swallowed, his voice firm despite the knot in his throat. "We're moving to a real home, a house in the city, a place where you won't have to worry anymore, where Ben and Lily will have a chance at a better life." Silence. Then in the next instant, Lily let out a small, disbelieving laugh, covering her mouth with both hands. Ben's face split into a grin so wide it looked like his whole heart had been poured into it. "A real home?" Lily whispered. Caleb nodded. Ben let out a whoop, running circles around the wagon, too overwhelmed to contain his excitement. Margaret, however, simply stared at him, her hands trembling. Her lips parted as if to speak, but no words came. Caleb stepped forward, reaching for her hands, folding them gently in his own. "It's real, Grandma," he said softly. "It's happening." Tears welled in her tired eyes. She lifted a hand to his cheek, her fingers warm and calloused from years of hardship. "I always knew God had something greater for you," she murmured. Caleb swallowed the lump in his throat, squeezing her hand. The rest of the day passed in a blur of packing what little they owned. It didn't take long. There had never been much to begin with. A few clothes, some worn blankets, Margaret's Bible, and Lily's threadbare stuffed rabbit that she refused to leave behind. And then for the last time, Caleb stepped outside and looked back at the place where they had survived for so many years. The house was small, broken, a symbol of all the hardship they had endured. But now it was only a chapter. Their story wasn't ending here. Margaret climbed into the wagon, Lily settling beside her, and Ben bouncing excitedly on the seat. Caleb took one last breath of the dry desert air before snapping the reins. The wheels turned, and they left Sage Hollow behind. As the town faded into the distance, Caleb felt something inside him shift. This was not just a journey to the city. This was a journey to the life they had always deserved. The years passed, but Caleb never forgot. The city had given him more than just a roof over his head and food on the table. It had given him a future. Under Samuel's guidance, he had risen from an eager boy willing to do any job to a respected businessman, learning the ways of trade, negotiation, and leadership. What had once been foreign to him, balancing ledgers, striking deals, managing people, was now second nature. But even as he stood in his office, surrounded by success, He knew that part of him had never left Sage Hollow. He carried it with him. Every time he walked past a child begging on the streets, he saw himself. Every time he heard of a mother struggling to feed her children, he thought of his own. Every time he passed by a church where a grandmother prayed for a miracle, he saw Margaret kneeling in the dust, whispering desperate pleas to God. And so one morning, as the city bustled outside his window, Caleb made a decision. It was time to go home. The road stretched endlessly before him, the desert sun casting long shadows over the dry earth. Caleb had traveled this path before, once as a desperate boy with nothing but hunger in his belly and prayers in his heart. But today he rode into Sage Hollow as a man with purpose. The wagon beneath him creaked under the weight of its cargo. Sacks of flour and rice, barrels of fresh water, warm blankets, and crates of medicine filled every inch of space. A second wagon followed behind, carrying workers, men and women who, like Caleb, had once struggled but now stood on the other side of hardship, ready to give back. The town looked almost exactly as he remembered it. The cracked roads, the sun-baked wooden houses, the familiar scent of dust and sage carried on the wind. But the people, oh, the people. Their faces bore the same weariness he had once worn, the same quiet desperation he had fought so hard to escape. As the wagon rolled into the town square, conversations hushed. Eyes turned toward him, recognition dawning slowly. And then someone whispered his name. Caleb! The murmurs spread, growing louder. Caleb climbed down from the wagon, the warm wind brushing against his face. He saw old neighbors, shopkeepers who had once turned him away, farmhands who had known his father, mothers who had clutched their children close when hunger gnawed at their doors. But there was no anger in Caleb's heart, only resolve. He cleared his throat, letting his voice carry across the square. I left this town with nothing, he said. I know what it means to go hungry, to feel forgotten, to wonder if life will ever be more than just surviving. Silence. He gestured toward the wagons. But I also know what it means to be given a chance, and now I'm here to give you one. A ripple of disbelief ran through the crowd. I brought food, Caleb continued, supplies, and work for those who need it. No more empty stomachs, no more hopeless nights. I can't change the past, but I can change the future. A child, barefoot, thin, much like Ben had been all those years ago, stepped forward hesitantly. He looked up at Caleb, his small hands clenched at his sides. Caleb crouched down, meeting the boy's wide eyes. You hungry? He asked gently. The boy nodded. Caleb smiled, reaching into the wagon for a loaf of bread and placing it in the boy's hands. And just like that, the wall of hesitation broke. The crowd surged forward, not with greed, but with gratitude. Tears mixed with laughter, voices rising in disbelief and joy. Mothers clutched sacks of flour as if they were gold. Fathers shook Caleb's hand with quiet thanks. And children, for the first time in a long time, smiled without fear of what tomorrow might bring. Caleb watched it all, his heart full. This was not an act of charity. It was redemption. His suffering had not been in vain. It had led him to this moment, to this purpose. And as he stood in the heart of the town that had once nearly broken him, he knew with certainty he had come back not as the boy who had left, but as the man he was meant to become. The city was quiet that night. The distant hum of life had faded into a soft, steady rhythm. The occasional creak of a wooden sign swaying in the breeze. The muffled laughter of families settling in for the night. The faint flicker of lanterns glowing behind lace curtains. Caleb sat on the porch of his home, the very home that had once been nothing more than an impossible dream. Margaret rocked gently in her chair beside him, her hands folded in her lap, her eyes turned toward the heavens. The stars stretched endlessly above them, their cold light casting a quiet glow over the rooftops. For a long time, neither of them spoke. Then in that stillness, Margaret let out a breath, slow, deep, filled with something that felt almost like peace. Our suffering, she murmured, brought us closer to God. Caleb turned to her, his jaw tightening. He had spent years running from that suffering, pushing against the weight of it, fighting tooth and nail to make sure Ben and Lily would never have to endure what he had. But now, sitting here, his hands rough from years of labor, his heart full in ways he had never imagined. He realized something. Margaret was right. The hunger, the cold, the desperate nights spent wondering if there would be a tomorrow. It had all shaped him. If his father had never been taken too soon, he might never have learned what it meant to be strong. If his mother had not passed, he might never have understood sacrifice. If he had never fallen to his knees in the desert, he might never have been given the vision that led him forward. If he had never left, he might never have returned, not just to his hometown, but to the people who still needed him. It hadn't been suffering for nothing. It had been preparation. He looked back at Margaret, his throat tight. "I understand now." She smiled, her weathered hand reaching for his. He squeezed it gently, then stood. "I need to go somewhere," he said. Margaret didn't ask where. She simply nodded, her eyes filled with the quiet wisdom that had guided him all these years. The walk through town was slow, thoughtful. The city, once overwhelming and foreign, now felt like home. The streets were lined with life, families gathering for supper, shopkeepers counting the day's earnings, children laughing in the alleyways. He had changed this place, and it had changed him. When he reached the small church at the end of the street, he hesitated for only a moment before stepping inside. The air was cool, the scent of old wood and candle wax filling his lungs. The pews were empty at this hour, but the flickering glow of a single candle near the altar told him someone had been here before him, whispering their own prayers into the stillness. Slowly, Caleb lowered himself to his knees. For years, he had prayed in desperation, for food, for shelter, for hope. Tonight, he prayed for none of those things. Tonight, he whispered only two words. "Thank you, Lord. Thank you for the hunger, because it taught me to fight. Thank you for the loss, because it showed me how to love. Thank you for the struggle, because it led me to something greater." He had been given pain, but also perseverance. He had been given hardship, but also faith. And now, as he rose to his feet and stepped back into the cool night air, he knew with unwavering certainty he had not been abandoned. He had been guided. Every step, every trial, every moment of suffering had led him here, to this life, to this purpose, to this grace. Life has a way of testing us, of pushing us to the very edge and making us question whether we have the strength to go on. Caleb's story is not just about hardship, it's about what we choose to do with it. How many times do we face struggles that seem insurmountable? How often do we feel abandoned, left to fight battles that seem unfair? And yet, looking back, we realize that those very moments of pain, loss, and desperation were shaping us into who we were meant to be. Caleb's journey teaches us that suffering is never without purpose. Every hardship, every tear, every sleepless night spent worrying about the future, they are not wasted. They refine us, strengthen us, and prepare us for something greater. But Caleb's story is not just about survival. It is about the power of choosing kindness. Even in his darkest moments, when hunger clawed at his stomach and uncertainty clouded his mind, he still found the strength to give, to help, to believe that goodness was worth holding on to, even when life gave him every reason to let it go. And that is the real lesson here. We don't just endure hardship for ourselves. We endure so that one day, when we are strong enough, we can turn around and extend a hand to someone who is still struggling. Maybe you've faced moments in your life when everything felt impossible. Maybe you've watched someone fight against overwhelming odds and come out stronger. If so, we'd love to hear your story. Share it in the comments below. Your experience might be the encouragement someone else needs today. And if this story touched your heart, help us spread its message. Like this video, subscribe to our channel, and share it with someone who might need to hear these words. Because in the end, faith, kindness, and perseverance are not just words. They are the light that carries us through the darkest nights. And sometimes they are the very things that bring us home. May God bless you and your loved ones. Thank you for being here.